Well, thank you very much. And I would like, first of all, to thank ILSI for inviting me to provide this update on what is going on in Mexico. It's a talk that very well could be entitled something like Lessons about How to Regulate Badly, things that you should not do. And I think it's also good to acknowledge the things that you have done wrong, because at least in many cases we are invited to give these sort of talks to countries like Bangladesh, Honduras, and many places where they are trying to come up with a regulatory system, and we can tell them what things they should not do. And I think it's going to hopefully be clear for you why I'm saying this. Okay, so when I came here to give more or less the same talk 3 years ago or 4 years ago, something like that, we started with mentioning on the legal status at that time that we had the biosafety law in 2005, and this was right after we became party to the Cartagena Protocol. So this is a way to bring down into our own law all what is contained in the Cartagena Protocol. We then had the rules of the Intersecretarial Commission of Biosafety, the operational rules of CIBIOGEM, rules of the biosafety law, and the updating of the rules of the competent authorities, a decree to modify the rules of the law to include the special regime for the protection of maize, and some other legal instruments. At this time, we have included these other ones: the protocol for the coordinated action to elicit releases into the environment of GMOs, several norms, protocols for the unintended or accidental releases of GMOs into the environment, the ratification of the Nagoya-Kuala Lumpur Protocol on Liability and Redress, and this is the last document, although this is being questioned at the moment, and we don't know whether it's going to, or rather, I'm almost sure it's going to be modified. I would like to mention a little bit about how all these laws, rules, and everything is implemented in Mexico, because sometimes the role of CIBIOGEM is not very clear. It's such a different system that I believe is worth going. Some of you may already know this, actually this slide, and understand what CIBIOGEM is all about, but I would like to go very quickly through our system. We have the biosafety law, whose objective is, as it says here, to regulate activities with GMOs to prevent, avoid, or reduce potential risks to human health and so on. Now, what are those activities? Well, we have exportation, importation, and here we have two different authorities. The Ministry of Economy, in terms of how much we are importing, all that issue with mainly with international trade is in many cases dealt by the Ministry of Economy. The Ministry of Internal Revenue, I think it's how you call it, Ministerio de Hacienda, it's the one that looks at the borders, okay? And they are in charge of looking, when we import something, to make sure that at the borders they see what is coming and that it's according to our regulations. We have, for confined use, which is for research and education or industrial production, a legal instrument which is called notification. So they only have to notify what they are doing with the GMOs, and they have to notify the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Environment, depending on the use that is going to be of that GMO. We have also environmental release for experimental pilot program or commercial releases. And in this case, the competent authority gives a permit, and the competent authority may be, again, agriculture or environment, depending on the use of the GMO. Okay? And for commercialization, for GMOs that are going to be used for food, feed, and process, for public health applications or bioremediation, the Ministry of Health has to provide an authorization. So we also have the ministry or the National Council for Science and Technology, which is involved. This is a very scientific issue, and they are involved in many ways. And we have involved here the Ministry of Education, because we want to start providing information to the very basic level, at the level of school children, at the level of agricultural schools, technical colleges, and so on, to provide all this information about what biotechnology is all about, what is biosafety. And so if you see, we have six ministries or six secretaries, and the National Council for Science and Technology, and they are all involved somehow with the issue of GMOs in Mexico. Therefore, although in the law they specify as competent authorities these four: environment, agriculture, health, and the Ministry of Treasury, as I mentioned, because they are the ones in charge of looking at the border issues, we have all these six secretaries: agriculture, environment, health, education, economy, the Treasury, and the National Council for Science and Technology. And they are the ones that form the commission, the Intersecretarial Commission for Biosafety. But this is a rather, it's like CIBIOGEM actually only exists when you get together all the ministers, all the secretaries. Then they decide what they need to do, what things to implement, or what steps to take to make sure that people complies with the law and so on. Once the meeting ends, everyone goes to their own office, and that's it. So then the executive secretary of CIBIOGEM is the one in charge of doing the work. And that is our office. I'm the executive secretary, and I have an office that has to keep track of what is mentioned in order to coordinate the efforts of all these different ministers or these secretaries. Okay? Now, we are not competent authorities. We don't give the permits. We don't provide authorizations. We don't do reviewing of the petitions, although that has been my job I did that for a long time, besides doing research. And now, as a public government official, I don't do much of that, but I try to follow with these issues of CIBIOGEM. In Mexico, for environmental releases, we have three stages: experimental releases, pilot program, and commercial releases. These two require previous authorization from the Ministry of Health because they are supposed to be large enough for the product to be actually going into market. Okay? Now, when there is a request for a permit for experimental, pilot program, or commercial, if it's an agronomic product, the submission goes to SAGARPA, the Ministry of Agriculture, but a copy of that goes to the Ministry of the Environment. And the Ministry of the Environment is going to provide an opinion, which is a binding opinion. Okay? So they have to also agree in order for SAGARPA to agree with that release. Okay? Now, one of the things that it's a bit difficult sometimes is actually to make sure, and this is one of our major roles, to make sure that in order for this not to become a problem, we are constantly getting the regulators, the reviewers from both of these secretaries together to discuss what are the main issues that have to be taken into account? What is the criteria that needs to be used? So most of the time, fortunately, they can agree on what things are important because we keep them constantly talking to each other, okay? There are some provisions, special provisions within the law. For instance, it talks about monitoring and surveillance, and until recently, we didn't have a properly system for monitoring or for surveillance, although this is a very difficult task anyway. At least in Mexico, it can be a nightmare, really, because it's just as simple as this. We import something like 10 million tons of corn, yellow corn, from the US, sometimes from South Africa, and that is mainly or mostly GM corn. Now, once it gets into Mexico and it begins to be distributed, for our peasants, there is no difference between grain and seed. If it's good to eat, if it looks good, it must be planted, tested, and see if they can use it. Okay? So quite often we find that some people use this material in their own fields, and that is always very complicated. Okay, so we have then established what we call the Mexican Monitoring Network and the National Network of Laboratories for the Detection, Identification, and Quantification of GMOs. What are these things? Well, first of all, we define monitoring as it is there. It's very wide, very broad, this definition, because it encompasses almost everything. All those activities intended to determine the presence of GMOs, if required, that is, for instance, if it's illegal, but if it's legal, it may not be required to determine the presence. We know it's there, so we are only going to monitor for impacts. So, as well as the possible effects derived from the environmental release, whether deliberate, involuntary, or accidental, of these organisms, the environment, animal and plant health, and taking into account social, economic aspects and possible risks to human health. So it's almost everything that you can think of. And for this, we have what we call 27 nodes of the network, which are mainly higher education institutes and university research centers, civil organizations, government entities, and so on. So we have in many different places. And what we do here is we can ask them, let's say, for instance, in the case of, we had this very recent problem with honey. With honey that was supposedly contaminated, or the honey contained pollen from genetically modified soybeans, and people was very worried that the European Union was not going to buy this honey anymore because they decided that they didn't want not even pollen from GM plants in their honey. This, immediately what we do is go to the closest place, which is Yucatan, for instance. This is in the peninsula where honey is produced, where they were going to have apparently this problem. And we set up a monitoring system for looking for biological issues. Is there really pollen there? How much pollen is there? Socioeconomic issues, commercial issues, and so on. So this is one of the examples of how we use, for instance, this network. Then we have well, this is some of the things that this network is doing: field monitoring, molecular resistance to Bt, for instance, look at insects, whether they are developing or not resistance, and so on. And we have also the network for actually the detection, identification, and quantification of GMOs. We have 3 main laboratories, one for the Ministry of Agriculture, one for Environment, and one for Health. And they are very well equipped, but we wanted to have more possibilities. And at the moment, we have 14 laboratories. And out of those 14, the ones that are at the moment present in our network are 10 laboratories from public research institutions. They were all, they had to conform to some quality level which was implemented which is looked after by CENAM, which is our National Center for Metrology. So they make sure that these laboratories comply with basic or rather high standards of quality. We are, at the moment, as I mentioned, we have 10 independent laboratories from 3 from the national government. And so we have the capability really for testing this quite accurately. And this reminds me, this is, for instance, where ILSI has been very helpful. When we talk about the workshops for sampling and so on, now that we have the capability for doing the analytical work, these sort of workshops are very helpful to actually harmonize methodology among these laboratories. So those are perhaps 2 of the main issues that have allowed us to comply with the law, because before any commercial releases, we had to have the capabilities for monitoring, surveillance, and identification. And this is some of the activities that we at the Executive Secretariat of CIBIOGEM are in charge of doing and getting it all right, because it's not something that one of the ministries have to do. It's for the whole of CIBIOGEM. Now, there are also some other provisions within the law, and one of them is on the promotion of scientific and technological research on biosafety and biotechnology. Our law, in our biosafety law, in Article 28, states that the federal executive will promote, support, and strengthen the scientific and technological research in the matter of biosafety and biotechnology. And with regard to biotechnology, this support will be oriented to encourage projects of research, development, and innovation. These projects must solve specific productive needs of the country and must benefit directly national producers. And here is where we are having the problems at the moment. We know that, although limited, Mexico has the scientific capability to develop agricultural products derived from modern biotechnology. The national research centers conducted field trials up to 2005. If you recall, that was the year when we enacted our law. So it was up to this moment, the year that the biosafety law was enacted. Then we have public perception about agricultural biotechnology is strongly divided and very controversial, mainly around the issue of maize, because we are centers of origin and diversity. The biosafety law is highly restrictive and does not foster local developments. Academic institutions are not encouraged to address biotechnology issues because there is also a lack of national industry demanding such products. Although this is maybe I think we can find who would be using these products if they were developed properly. And researchers are not prepared nor willing to engage in cumbersome regulatory procedures. Now, let's see what happens. This is how we have had all the requests for releases into the environment. And up to 2005, before 2004, we had some requests from public research organizations or research institutions. From then on, it was not until 2011 that we again had one single petition. And this is, as I was mentioning, because the way we have written our law. First of all, is a difference between those countries that are producing and using the technology and countries that are importing products and using only the products. So one of the points in our law states, for instance, that foreign companies that want to have experimental releases or commercial releases of GMO products, they must have this product must be already approved in the country of origin. That sounds reasonable. At least to many people sounds quite reasonable, because they say, well, we don't want a foreign company coming here and testing something that they haven't even tested in their own country. That sounds reasonable. So, but what in reality, what it means is that all the companies that bring their GMO products, for instance, into Mexico, they already have it, in most cases, already commercialized in the country of origin. They have tons of data. They have all the data that you want is there. So the law asks for everything, and the companies comply. They have all the data there. But when you have one national developer that goes there with a product which is, he just wants to prove the concept. He wants only to get it out of the greenhouse or the growth chamber and see how it works in the field. They ask everything of that product. So they just don't have the data. And they don't have, and maybe it's not mandatory that he provides all that data, but then he must state very clearly why he doesn't have it and how is he going to get it, because at the experimental level is when you should be asking less. The experimental releases are going to provide the data to feed subsequent petitions. But in this case, the rules that we have, the requirements, just ask for everything because home companies have complied. Okay? So the researchers could very well go and spend a lot of time trying in saying why that data is not available. But they have to put it in the context or in such a language that the regulator understands it in the context of the safety evaluation that he has to look after. So that has been very difficult. We just ask for everything, and that hasn't been helpful at all. The other thing is that we have two prohibitions in our law regarding the GMOs. One is that GMOs should not be used for to make biological weapons. Okay, that's fine, although I don't think anyone is going to ask for a release of these sort of things. And the other one is that maize cannot be used if the modification is going to stop maize being useful as food. Okay? And that also makes sense, makes a lot of sense. But then we had this petition. It's a GM maize with drought tolerant, with an antisense for trehalose. So it sounds quite innocuous in a way. So when this researcher wanted to take it into the field, they say, okay, does that comply with the law? Is that not going to pose any problem with corn being used as food? He says, no, it's not going to be a problem. Well, but you need the authorization from the Ministry of Health. And the Ministry of Health just asks, again, for everything. And this GM, it's, or this maize variety, it's a model system, it's a laboratory system that this researcher was using just to test whether her idea was going to work or not. But then she has to spend 2 years getting data for the Ministry of Health to show that is innocuous, that is not going to cause any problem, that it's still food. And she's never going to use this product as the final product. So when you have those sort of things, it's just this, it's not encouraging for any researcher to want to go into producing GM products for the country. And it's not that we don't have researchers involved in these issues. This is something that we got from the National Council for Science and Technology. And we have research areas involving the use or development of product based on GMOs. We have perhaps quite a good number of research projects. 40% of those could be agrobiotechnology applications. But once they prove the concept at the level of the greenhouse or the growth chamber, they published and moved to something else. Why? Because it's just very difficult to get a permit for a field release, even if it's an experimental field release. So what we are doing in our office at the moment is trying to provide financial aid to improve update containment facilities, such as greenhouses, to comply with regulations, so they can keep working on these issues. We try to tell them that it's still worth doing it. We are financing experimental field trials. We are paying for them with biotech products, encouraging and helping different secretaries and CONACYT to generate special programs to encourage technological research involving GMOs. This is how we got that researcher actually getting her products into the field. Providing help to address regulatory issues. So the Executive Secretariat of CIBIOGEM provides funds and complete guidance and help to researchers to address regulatory issues. So we are working as if we were the Office of Regulatory Affairs of a company for them. Because it's also unfair, in a way, to provide good grants to good researchers that have good ideas on how to come up with solutions through this biotechnology. And once they have the product, they have to become start dealing with all this bureaucracy for years, and it's just doesn't help the issue of having national products. So this is our main problem now, because we have a lot of issues with public perception, and we have tried to give talks and to provide information in our web page and everything. But at the end, I truly believe that if we want to change that public perception, it's going to be by showing society that this technology can also be useful for our own country to solve social issues, to solve our own problems, and not that is something that is going to be only used by large companies like Monsanto, pioneers, and all that. As long as we don't show that we have the capability to own this technology, to use it, and to put it to good use in social terms, I think all this public perception is going to keep like it is now. Okay. Thank you.